New at 5, Governor Landry defends the use of non-disclosure agreements for economic development projects.
But as Sabrina Wilson reports, a constitutional law professor says no contract trumps Louisiana's constitution and public records laws.
Corporate America has competition out there, and they want an opportunity to be able to have discussions with elected officials and to ensure that policies meet their expectation.
Moments after announcing SpaceX will build a giant spaceport in Vermilion Parish, Governor Landry defended the use of non-disclosure agreements by state government for some economic development efforts.
You think I want other states to know what we're working on? Quite frankly, that's what has continued to happen to Louisiana before I became governor.
A spokeswoman for the Louisiana Economic Development Department tells Fox 8 LED signed an NDA with SpaceX in February.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the scale and scope of non-disclosure agreements has exploded since Governor Landry's administration has been negotiating with Meta and SpaceX and perhaps other companies to bring business to Louisiana.
Loyola law professor Dane Cialino says NDAs are not uncommon in private industry.
But when the public is involved, there is, under the Louisiana Constitution, a state constitutional right of the public to see the documents of their government. And the government can't sign away the public's right to know.
And on NDAs signed by public officials outside of LED?
Now, there are narrow exceptions that allow the Louisiana Department of Economic Development to sign limited NDAs, but NDAs being signed by people outside of, and public officials outside of the Economic Development Department, and elected officials like members of the state Senate, members of Governor Landry's office, those aren't covered by these exceptions.
Some Vermilion Parish residents complained that they were kept in the dark about the project.
The not knowing anything, I think the people of Pecan Island should have been told something first.
I asked the governor about that.
I mean, we will start having discussions with the residents. We were already talking to residents.
This year, the Louisiana legislature passed a package of incentives for aerospace businesses. Still, in terms of NDAs and public records, Cialino says.
I would expect if this issue is pushed by any members of the media or the public, that the court would order disclosure of the NDAs themselves and perhaps any other related documents.
One of the new state laws relates to public records and provides an exception for certain records of critical infrastructure of aerospace facilities or aerospace activities. Meg.